So a very important part of your introduction is your thesis statement. That's not, of course, the only thing in your introduction. Yeah, you want that attention-grabbing opening sentence or two. You want to kind of set up what it is you're talking about. But there are a couple other things to keep in mind when it comes to developing a good introduction. First of all, prepare yourself now to recognize you may need to rewrite your introduction. Very rarely can you sit down to write your paper and start at the beginning, type it the whole way through to the end, and you have done everything perfectly, and your paper's ready to present. All right, here it is. Often, we just need something to get us going. Right? I just need to start typing some things, to just get some ideas flowing, get some things on paper. That means, however, that when you get done, you need to go back and rewrite, revise where necessary. Because where you started off may not be where you end up. I've read several papers by students that essentially is a journey. They've kind of started one place, and by the end they've ended up someplace else. If it's a reflection paper, that's one thing. A research paper, if you start off saying, well, I don't think that the woman taken in adultery passage belongs in the Gospel of John, and you end up with, and by the way, that's why this passage belongs in the Gospel of John, you've gone two different directions. But I've seen papers similar to that, where they started in one place and end up someplace different. When you end up someplace different, guess what? Go back and rewrite that first part. Think about, okay, now that I'm done, I really think that this needs to be moved here, this needs to be moved here. What I thought I was going to argue, I've not argued, I'm writing something different. So prepare yourself to rewrite. Very rarely does God divinely inspire research papers. I won't say it's impossible, because with God, nothing's impossible. But I highly doubt it. So be prepared to rewrite. That means that, feel free to move stuff around. Be open to letting somebody else read it. They might not have the time at this point, but for future, right? Try to get done so you have the chance for somebody else to read it, so they can say, wait a second, I don't understand what you're saying here, or this doesn't really fit. So be prepared to rewrite. A good introduction needs to set your focus. As I've said before, I didn't invent this phrase, but I do really appreciate it. You're not writing a mystery novel. Set it up. This is what I'm going to be arguing. Don't leave me guessing. By the end of that first paragraph, I should know. If it's a case like Mark 16 or John chapter 8, I should know by the end of that first paragraph whether or not you believe it belongs there. If you're writing about 1 Peter 3, the Spirit's in prison, by the end of that first paragraph, I should know what you believe that passage is all about. So set your focus. The introduction, of course, also serves as a map for your paper, giving you guidelines. Okay, I need to talk about these things, as well as giving the reader guidelines. All right, this is what they're going to be talking about. And of course, ultimately, the purpose of your introduction is to set up your argument. Not just present some nice, interesting facts, not just kind of meander around related topics, but set up that argument.
Okay.
Go ahead.
What if our passage contains more than one controversial subject? Would it be okay just to choose one?
Yeah, there are some of those passages that would have more than one, and so that's basically up to you. Right? And so whichever ones, you don't have to cover everything about a particular passage. You're doing 1 Peter 3, right?
Well, yeah. Reminding me with that, there's 19 where it talks about the spirits, but it also talks about baptism, so I just look on spirits.
Either one of those is fine, right? But in a case like that, I wouldn't even talk about the other one, right? And just say I'm focusing on the spirits in prison, or I'm focusing on baptism, how it's presented. Other questions? Right, let's talk about the body of the paper then. What are you hoping to achieve in the body of your paper? Well, there are a couple of things that you want to do. First of all, you need to be integrating your sources. So the body of your paper takes your evidence, the sources you've looked at, and integrates them in such a way that you're advancing your argument. Not just, here's what this person said about this passage, here's what this person said about this passage, here's what that person said about this passage. It means discovering, okay, my main point is, woman taken in adultery passage belongs in the Gospel of John in chapter 8. That's the focus of my article, or my research paper. Instead of just saying, here is this scholarly list, I'm going to talk about, okay, the textual evidence, the content, and the presentation of Jesus. And so the first section of my paper is going to integrate sources related to the textual evidence. The second would integrate sources related to the content of the passage. The third would integrate sources related to the character of Jesus presented. So I'm not just going to give somebody a list of here are some different sources. I'm going to integrate them into my overall point. Ultimately, your paper is presenting your interpretation. If I was just interested in finding out the different options that were available, I could do that myself. What I want to see is your interpretation of this. Your voice should predominate. Make those sources work for what you want to say. So the integration of sources should be done in such a way where it is clear what you are saying, whether or not that agrees with what other people have said. Now, of course, we have to have some humility, and there might be some evidence that it exists there that scholars of Greek or Hebrew know better what that particular passage means with respect to the Greek or Hebrew than I do. But don't let that give you a complex of, well, I'll just talk about what the scholars say. No, you still need to side with one particular side or another. The body of your paper should also demonstrate the importance of your topic. Again, you highlight that, you point towards that in your introduction, but you should also discuss that in your paper. Especially when you're thinking about how you're integrating those sources. Thinking about things like, well, so what? As you write things, think about, okay, somebody saying to you, so what? So talking about the importance is a very important part. And then finally, also keep in mind, in the body of your paper, to clearly connect your ideas. Providing those signposts, those transitions, words or phrases that are going to allow your reader to follow you throughout your argument. But one of the things to think about that's very important in your paper is the distinction between description and analysis. In some ways, it's important to describe. And so, for example, in a paper on John chapter 8, there are some things you might need to describe. So if I'm going to describe John chapter 8, what are some of the things that I would do? Describe John 8 for me. Okay, so one way of describing John 8 would just be a summary. And here's the things that happened in that passage, right? And so it's talking about the Pharisees coming and bringing with them a woman caught in adultery and what Jesus does, right? So description is simply saying, right, here's a summary of what takes place. But additionally with this passage, there are other things that would be description. Things like the manuscript presence or lack of presence. I'm describing, I'm just telling you. Right? There are some manuscripts where it's present, there are some that aren't. That's just description. I'm just describing to you what the case is. Description is also telling me what people have said. Here's what people have said about this passage. So far, I've just described, whether that's a summary of the passage, whether that is talking about whether it's there or not, whether how people have talked about it. Same thing is true with any of the papers that you will write. A summary of the passage is just description. How people have talked about it is just description. What you need to do is move to analysis. Analysis is a different level of thinking. It does not require too much, it requires some order of thinking, a higher order of thinking, to take some information, present it in another form, rewording it, summarizing it. But analysis is a higher order of thinking that is important as well. So what's the difference? Description is, right, here's what it is. Analysis goes beyond that and says things like, why is this important? What does this tell us? How might we use this in an academic setting, scholarly setting, ministerial setting? What does this tell us about Jesus as analysis? Right? Description would be just giving you a summary of the event. Analysis would then be saying, okay, what are some of the characteristics of Jesus that are present in this passage? And so in thinking about the passages, the papers you will be doing, you can describe, here's what this passage says. You can describe it saying, here's what commentators have said about this passage. But analysis gets into, why is this important? What does this matter? The consequences of a particular line of thinking. If we accept that this is true, then we must also accept, or we must also do this, or we must also... Now, keeping in mind, of course, we need to, be careful that we don't fall into those traps of false reasoning that we talked about last Wednesday, where if we accept that this doesn't belong in John 8, then the entire Bible is uninspired. So don't do any of that false reasoning, because that's not good reasoning. But it's important for us to do analysis and not just description. Questions or comments? Anything that needs to be clarified? Good.
For mine, there's like a bunch of different interpretations of what like the husband or wife could be. So I would need to explore different kinds of, like pick one. And
well, ultimately, what you want to do with something like that, where you have multiple interpretations, is to try and provide. I mean, it's not going to be the entirety of your paper, but try and provide a overview of here are some of the options on how people talk about this passage. But then you want to go beyond that and say, I believe it is this because of, and then you're going to, there might be 3 reasons why you believe it's what you believe, right? So in a case like that where you have multiple occurrences, talking about some of that it would be appropriate, but ultimately what I want to see is what you think and why.
Can we use personal pronouns in paper?
Can you use personal pronouns in paper? Yes, judiciously. It's preferable to use third-person pronouns. To talk as kind of the omniscient narrator. But I'm not necessarily going to dock you points if you use, I believe that this is the case. Right? You use this one. I'm not necessarily going to say, oh, you can't use first-person pronouns or something like that.
I want to cite if I have sources that say the exact same thing, the exact same, I don't know, the interpretation, it says the same thing. If I write that on paper, how would I cite that?
One of the things that you can do if you've discovered multiple sources and they both support the same idea, would be in your footnote include both of those sources. And so, with the page number and then, put a semicolon between them or something. So indicating that you've used both sources, as you referred to both sources in the process of examining this.